Hello orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today we're going to repot a Phalaenopsis orchid. This is a miniature type orchid and it's a no ID from a grocery store. This belongs to my colleague, but today this video is about sharing the steps that I normally take to repot an orchid and the reasons behind why I do certain steps certain way, and hopefully this would be beneficial for those of you who are interested in learning more about how to properly repot an orchid. I like to soak an orchid really well before I take it out of the container or start to peel away the media, because it will be much easier when the media is wet. And the water that I used is soft water. As you can see here on the TDS meter, the ppm is only 3. For my reverse osmosis water, usually it can be as low as 0, so 000. But as the filter gets older and older, the number will gradually increase. For those of you who do not use reverse osmosis water, you don't have to worry, because as long as it's soft water, it's within the soft water range, under 150 parts per million in general. It's actually pretty soft for orchid roots. And you know, there are many different sources of soft water: rainwater, snow water, and sometimes distilled water can also be readily available from grocery store. So these are all different type of soft water that you can use for your orchid. One thing about using soft water is that you have to make sure that you add fertilizer to it from time to time. Otherwise, these water really don't contain any nutrients or mineral, not much anyway. Particularly distilled water and reverse osmosis water, they really don't have, these two types of water, they really don't have much at all. So after soaking this orchid for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I started to take it out just to see how many viable roots there were, and this orchid had quite a bit of good roots, and I suspect that this orchid was a little bit underwater, so the roots are pretty good. Typically, when I repot an orchid for a friend or colleague, those orchids would have rotting roots or rotten roots due to overwatering. So this orchid is actually on the opposite. It's slightly underwatered, so the root system was actually pretty decent. Now, as you can see here in the video clip, the orchid had a flower spike, but that flower spike had already dried up. So in a later part of this video, you'll see that I was cutting the flower spike because it's already dry. But if the flower spike were still green, I would just leave it. And that's because I am one of the believers who thinks that there is definitely tree sap or nutrients that can be recycled back into the plant itself. So when it's green, I would not cut the flower spike. Another reason is that some orchids are sequential bloomers, and if their flower spikes are still green, they could potentially grow longer and give you more buds and flowers. So before you cut a flower spike, you want to ask yourself whether this flower spike is still viable, is still green, or whether this orchid is a sequential bloomer. And speaking of cutting something, when you cut any parts of your orchid with a scissor, you want to make sure that you use certain measures to sterilize your scissor. For example, you can use hydrogen peroxide, you could use alcohol, you could use flame to further sterilize the cutting tool, so that way you can avoid having any type of infection. Actually, I should say reduce the likelihood of getting infections. This orchid was very tightly packed in sphagnum moss in a very tiny, small, flimsy cup. So I went ahead and used a scissor and just cut it open instead of trying to push the orchid out from the bottom, which I was afraid to hurt some orchid roots. After removing most of the sphagnum moss, I actually still use a faucet to flush further because there are always some small pieces of sphagnum moss that are caught in between roots, especially toward the bottom of the orchid. So if you could also use a shower head in the shower as long as the water pressure is high enough that it can flush out or flush away those tiny little sphagnum moss pieces, and that way you can make sure that it's properly cleaned. And I also still use hydrogen peroxide and alcohol to spray on the roots, just so that it would this is essentially another opportunity to further disinfect the orchid roots. I know some people don't use hydrogen peroxide and alcohol to spray on their roots. I know they don't like to do it. I know some of my friends who don't do it. I personally do it, and I find it helpful because sometimes you really do have some hitchhikers like snails, scale, or even mealybugs hide in between someplace that you can't really see with your own eyes. So using alcohol and hydrogen peroxide really is it's like a best practice when you're repotting orchids. And because this orchid is going to be in the office environment, and because the media later you're gonna see is going to be bark chips, so I actually went ahead and still put some sphagnum moss, a tiny amount, in the middle of the root section, just so that this orchid can have slightly higher moist media to last for a little bit longer than, say, a week in an office environment, which typically is slightly drier than normal. And after it's all potted up, I use a solution that contained liquid seaweed, calcium, and magnesium, and I soak it for maybe 10-15 minutes. Usually I will wait for another 24 hours before I give it water, but the next day I had to give this orchid to a colleague, so I just went ahead and soak it really well in hopes that this orchid would adapt to the new media, new cup quickly, and hopefully it would continue to thrive from here. The cup that I use for this orchid has many ventilation holes on the side, and then from there I put it into a medium-sized 12-ounce plastic cup, and then the outer cup, the decorative pot, is a ceramic pot. And I still give this orchid a the cup in the middle, the plastic cup in the middle, because for a lot of the orchids that I purchased from grocery stores, if they're potted in bark chips and I haven't repotted them into my current favorite setup, semi-hydro, then they're still in bark chips, and I just put them in a plastic cup like this, and they tend to grow really well, and I suspect that the plastic cup provides additional retention of the moisture. And another benefit of using this double cup method is that this cup can also be serve as the soaking cup when you're soaking your orchid in whatever solution you prepare for your orchid, and then you just have to take it out, dump out the water, put this orchid back into the original cup, and that way you're not sharing cups, and you also have a way to retain slightly more moisture for a longer period of time. So I personally like this method, and my orchids in bark chips seem to like this method as well. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!